I'm recording this at 2:47 in the morning because I can't sleep, and I can't get the image out of my head of my dead best friend sitting at his desk, typing on his computer as if he never died. 3 weeks ago, Marcus Thompson was killed in a car accident. 3 weeks ago, I watched them lower his coffin into the ground while his mother sobbed uncontrollably and his girlfriend collapsed from grief. 3 weeks ago, I said goodbye to the person who had been my closest friend for the past 5 years, my cubicle neighbor, my lunch buddy, and the only coworker who truly understood my sense of humor. But every morning since then, at exactly 8:47 a.m., Marcus walks through the front doors of Peterson Marketing Solutions and goes to work like nothing has changed. Let me start from the beginning, because what I'm about to tell you sounds impossible, and I need you to understand that I was never someone who believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. My name is David, I'm 28 years old, and I work as a digital marketing specialist at a mid-sized advertising firm in Denver, Colorado. I have a business degree, I pay my taxes on time, and until 3 weeks ago, the strangest thing I believed in was the possibility of life on other planets. Marcus and I started at Peterson Marketing on the same day 5 years ago. We were both fresh college graduates, nervous about our first real jobs, and assigned to cubicles right next to each other in the open-plan office layout that corporate America seems to love so much. From day one, we clicked. We had the same dark sense of humor, the same taste in music, and the same tendency to make sarcastic comments about the motivational posters our boss hung around the office. Over the years, our friendship deepened beyond just workplace camaraderie. We grabbed lunch together every day at the sandwich shop across the street. We went to concerts on weekends, and we complained to each other about dating, rent prices, and the endless stream of team-building exercises our HR department inflicted upon us. Marcus was the kind of friend who remembered your birthday without Facebook reminders, who would cover for you when you were running late, and who always had your back during stressful client presentations. He was also obsessed with his work in a way that I both admired and worried about. Marcus stayed late almost every night, came in early most mornings, and checked his email constantly, even on weekends. He had this dream of starting his own marketing agency someday, and he treated every project at Peterson like it was practice for running his own business. His desk was always perfectly organized, his reports were always submitted ahead of deadline, and his client satisfaction scores were consistently the highest in our department. Hit the like button if you've ever had a friend who is completely dedicated to their career, because Marcus's work ethic becomes important to understanding what happened after his death. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in November. Marcus had stayed late again, working on a presentation for a major client meeting the next morning. I had offered to stay and help him, but he waved me off, saying he was almost finished and that one of us should get some sleep. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. "Go home, Dave. One of us should get some sleep." The police report said he fell asleep at the wheel around 11:30 p.m., about 5 miles from his apartment. His car drifted across the center line on a dark stretch of road and collided head-on with a delivery truck. The truck driver walked away with minor injuries. Marcus died instantly. I found out the next morning when our boss, Janet Peterson, called an emergency staff meeting and delivered the news with tears streaming down her face. The office fell completely silent, except for the sound of people crying and the hum of fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed too bright and too harsh for such devastating news. Someone turned off Marcus's computer. Someone else covered his desk with a black cloth. The client presentation he had been working on was canceled out of respect. The funeral was held the following Tuesday at a small church in Marcus's hometown about an hour outside Denver. The entire office attended, and I served as one of his pallbearers, along with his college roommate, his older brother, and 3 of his cousins. His girlfriend Sarah gave a eulogy that made everyone in the church cry, talking about how Marcus had been planning to propose to her next month, and how he had already picked out a ring. His mother hugged me afterwards and thanked me for being such a good friend to her son, which made me feel simultaneously honored and heartbroken. After the funeral, I thought that would be the end of the Marcus chapter of my life. I expected to grieve, to miss him terribly, and eventually to heal enough to remember him with fondness rather than overwhelming sadness. I expected his empty cubicle to be reassigned to someone new, his projects to be distributed among the remaining staff, and his presence to fade gradually from our daily office routine. I never expected to see him walk through our office doors the following Monday morning. Let me know in the comments if you've ever lost someone close to you, because what happened that first morning made me question everything I thought I understood about death. It was 8:47 a.m. when Marcus arrived for work. I know the exact time because I was staring at my computer clock, dreading the moment when I would have to look over at his empty desk and confront the reality that my best friend was never coming back. But then I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, followed by the soft squeak of Marcus's shoes on the polished concrete floor. I looked up expecting to see Janet or one of my other coworkers, but instead I saw Marcus walking toward our section of the office with the same purposeful stride he had used every morning for 5 years. He was wearing his favorite navy blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, carrying his beaten-up leather messenger bag, and holding a large coffee from the Starbucks in the lobby. Everything about him looked exactly the same as it had the last time I saw him alive. My first reaction was relief so intense it made me dizzy. Marcus wasn't dead. There had been some terrible mistake, some mix-up with the identity of the accident victim. The funeral, the grief, the devastating phone call from Janet. It had all been a horrible error that we could now laugh about and move past. I started to call out to him, to express my joy and confusion, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent light seemed to pass through his body rather than casting shadows. Maybe it was the fact that his footsteps, which I had heard clearly moments before, were no longer making any sound on the floor. Or maybe it was the expression on his face, focused and determined, but somehow distant, as if he were looking through the world rather than at it. Marcus walked directly to his desk, set down his coffee cup, and opened his laptop computer. The black cloth that had been draped over his workspace was gone, though I couldn't remember seeing anyone remove it. His family photos were back in their usual positions, his stack of client folders was perfectly organized, and his motivational calendar was turned to the current date. But here's what made my blood run cold. When I looked around the office to see if anyone else was witnessing this impossible scene, I realized that my coworkers were going about their morning routines as if nothing unusual was happening. Jessica, who sat in the cubicle directly across from Marcus, was typing on her computer and occasionally glancing up, but her eyes looked right through the space where Marcus was sitting. Tom, whose desk was behind Marcus's, walked past carrying a stack of papers and moved around the chair where Marcus was seated as if it were empty. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, because what I witnessed over the next few hours convinced me that I was either losing my mind or experiencing something that defied every law of nature I had ever learned. I sat frozen at my desk for what felt like hours, watching Marcus work on his computer while the rest of the office went about their business, as if he wasn't there. Every few minutes I would blink hard or rub my eyes, hoping that when I looked again, the hallucination would be gone. But Marcus remained at his desk, typing steadily, occasionally sipping from his coffee cup and consulting the notes in his leather portfolio exactly as he had done every day for the past 5 years. The most unsettling part wasn't just seeing my dead friend, it was watching how perfectly normal he looked while doing completely impossible things. When he reached for his coffee cup, his hand passed through it without making contact, yet somehow he still seemed to be drinking. When he typed on his laptop, I could hear the soft clicking of keys, but the screen remained black and lifeless. When he answered his desk phone, I could hear his side of conversations, but when I checked the phone system, there were no incoming calls registered to his extension. Around 10:30 a.m., Marcus got up from his desk and walked toward the break room, just like he did every weekday morning to refill his coffee. I followed him, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I was desperate to understand what I was experiencing. In the break room, I watched him go through his usual routine, dumping out the old coffee, rinsing his mug in the sink, and preparing a fresh cup with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. But when I looked at the actual break room, everything was exactly as it had been when I entered. The coffee maker was turned off, no mugs were in the sink, and the sugar dispenser sat untouched on the counter. Marcus was interacting with objects that existed only in his perception, going through the motions of a routine that no longer had any connection to physical reality. "Marcus," I whispered, feeling foolish but unable to contain my desperation any longer. He turned toward me, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on my face. There was a flicker of recognition, a hint of the warm smile I had known so well, but then his expression became confused and distant again. "Hey Dave," he said, his voice sounding exactly as it always had. "Did you finish the Morrison account analysis? Janet wants to review it this morning." The Morrison account had been completed and delivered to the client 2 months before Marcus's death. We had celebrated its success with drinks at our usual happy hour spot. But Marcus was asking about it as if it were current, urgent, unfinished business. "Marcus," I said more firmly, "you died. You were in a car accident 3 weeks ago. We went to your funeral. He looked at me with the same confused expression, then shrugged and walked back toward his desk. I followed, my heart pounding and my hands trembling, trying to process what had just happened. Hit the like button if this conversation is already unsettling you, because what happened next made me realize that Marcus wasn't just appearing at work. He was trapped in some kind of supernatural loop. Over the next several days, I began to document Marcus's behavior, taking notes on his schedule, his activities, and his interactions with the environment around him. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Marcus was reliving the same workday over and over again, but it wasn't the day he died. Instead, he seemed to be stuck in a composite of all his typical workdays, performing a greatest hits collection of his usual office routine. He arrived every morning at 8:47 a.m., the exact time he used to clock in when he was alive. He worked on projects that had been completed months or even years ago, answered phone calls that weren't actually happening, and attended meetings that existed only in his memory. At 12:15 p.m., he would leave for lunch and return exactly 1 hour later with a sandwich from Tony's Deli, even though Tony's had closed permanently 6 months before Marcus's death. The most heartbreaking part was watching him interact with people who couldn't see him. Marcus would wave good morning to Jessica, ask Tom about his weekend plans, and stop by Janet's office to discuss client strategies. From his perspective, these conversations were happening normally, but in reality, he was talking to people who had no idea he was there. I tried several times to break through to him, to make him understand what had happened, but every conversation followed the same pattern. He would seem to recognize me for a moment, respond to whatever I said, but then immediately default back to treating me like a coworker in a normal office environment. If I mentioned his death, the accident, or the funeral, he would look confused and quickly change the subject to some work-related topic. But the most disturbing observation was how his presence was affecting the office, even though most people couldn't consciously perceive him. Jessica started complaining about feeling watched and developed a habit of looking over her shoulder constantly. Tom began avoiding Marcus's area of the office, claiming it felt cold and made him uncomfortable. Janet started having trouble sleeping and mentioned to several people that she felt like Marcus was still around trying to finish his work. Comment below what you think was keeping Marcus trapped at the office, because what I discovered about his final project explained everything. The breakthrough came when I decided to investigate what Marcus had been working on the night he died. I stayed late one evening and accessed his computer files, looking for clues about why he might be unable to leave the office. What I found was a project that consumed him in ways I had never fully understood while he was alive. Marcus had been secretly developing a comprehensive business plan for his own marketing agency. The files on his computer contained months of research, financial projections, client acquisition strategies, and detailed plans for leaving Peterson Marketing to start his own company. He had been working on this dream quietly, staying late to research competitors, develop service packages, and create marketing materials for a business he hoped to launch. But the project was nowhere near completion. There were dozens of unfinished documents, half-completed spreadsheets, and notes for presentations he never got to give. His business plan was maybe 60% finished, and based on his calendar notes, he had been hoping to complete everything by the end of the year so he could give Janet his 2 weeks' notice in January. Marcus had died with his most important work unfinished, and apparently, that was enough to trap his spirit in the office where he had spent so many hours pursuing his entrepreneurial dream. The more I learned about his secret project, the more I understood his supernatural behavior. The phone calls he was taking were conversations with potential clients he had researched but never contacted. The presentations he was working on were pitches for the agency that never got to exist. The meetings he attended were strategy sessions for a business that died with him. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had unfinished dreams that felt more important than anything else in your life, because understanding Marcus's obsession helped me realize why he couldn't move on. But understanding the reason for his haunting didn't make it any less disturbing to experience. As the days passed, Marcus's presence became more noticeable to other people in the office, even if they couldn't see him directly. Computers would freeze when he tried to use them, phones would ring with no caller on the line, and the temperature around his desk remained consistently 10 degrees colder than the rest of the office. People started avoiding his section of the building. The office cleaning crew refused to work in that area after hours, claiming they heard typing sounds coming from empty cubicles. The IT department received constant complaints about technical problems that only occurred near Marcus's old desk, but every time they investigated, they found nothing wrong with the equipment. Most disturbing of all, I began to notice that Marcus was becoming more solid, more present with each passing day. What had started as a translucent figure that I could barely see was becoming increasingly opaque and real-looking. His interactions with physical objects were becoming more successful. I watched him actually move papers on his desk, turn pages in his notebook, and even leave coffee stains on documents. It was as if his obsession with completing his unfinished work was allowing him to claw his way back into the physical world, growing stronger and more connected to our reality with each day that passed. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what happened when Marcus finally became solid enough to affect the physical world proved that some obsessions are strong enough to overcome death itself. By the end of the second week, Marcus had become solid enough that other people were starting to notice him peripherally. Not clearly enough to recognize him or understand what they were seeing, but enough to feel uneasy, to sense movement in their peripheral vision, to experience the growing certainty that something was wrong in our office. Jessica was the first to start asking direct questions. She approached me during our lunch break, looking exhausted and stressed. "Dave," she said, "I know this sounds crazy, but do you ever feel like Marcus is still here? Like, I know he's dead, I went to his funeral, but sometimes I swear I see someone sitting at his desk out of the corner of my eye." I had been dreading this conversation for days, trying to decide how much I could tell anyone without sounding completely insane. "What do you mean?" I asked, stalling for time. "I mean, I think I'm seeing things," Jessica continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Yesterday, I could have sworn someone was typing at his computer. I heard the keyboard clicking for like 10 minutes, but when I looked directly at his desk, no one was there. And his chair, sometimes it looks like someone is sitting in it, but then I blink and it's empty." "Maybe you're just missing him," I suggested weakly, knowing it was a completely inadequate explanation for what she was experiencing. "That's what I thought too, but it's getting worse, not better. And it's not just me. Tom asked HR if we could move his desk because he says Marcus's area gives him the creeps. The cleaning lady won't vacuum over there anymore. Even Janet mentioned that she feels like someone is watching her when she walks past that section." I wanted to tell Jessica everything, that she wasn't crazy, that Marcus was indeed still coming to work, that I could see him clearly, and had been watching his supernatural routine for 2 weeks. But I also knew that admitting I could see our dead coworker would either make me sound completely insane, or worse, might somehow make Marcus's presence stronger and more disruptive to everyone else. Instead, I suggested that maybe the office should have Marcus's desk cleared out and reassigned to someone new, hoping that removing his physical workspace might encourage his spirit to move on. But when I mentioned this idea to Janet, she looked uncomfortable and changed the subject quickly. Later that afternoon, I understood why Janet was reluctant to disturb Marcus's workspace. I was working late, as I often did now in order to observe Marcus's extended evening routine, when I overheard Janet on a phone call in her office. Her door was partially open, and her voice carried clearly across the empty office. "I don't know what to tell you, Margaret," she was saying to someone, probably her sister who lived in California. "I know how it sounds, but I swear Marcus is still working here. Not like a ghost or anything supernatural, but I keep finding work on my desk that no one admits to doing. Reports that get completed overnight, client research that appears in my email from accounts we never even contacted. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content." Because Janet's revelation made me realize that Marcus wasn't just haunting the office, he was still trying to do his job. This explained something I had been wondering about for days. I had noticed that Marcus's supernatural work routine was producing actual results. Documents were being updated, emails were being sent, and projects were advancing in ways that seemed impossible if he was just going through the motions of work without actually accomplishing anything. But if Marcus was somehow still able to affect digital systems, to manipulate computers and send emails and complete assignments, then his haunting was far more complex and dangerous than I had initially realized. He wasn't just a residual spirit replaying familiar actions. He was an active, intelligent entity who was continuing to work despite being dead. The implications were terrifying. If Marcus could access our computer systems, what else might he be able to do? Was he reading our emails, monitoring our phone calls, observing our private conversations? Had his obsession with work created a supernatural entity that was now permanently integrated into our office environment? My questions were answered the next morning when I arrived at work to find a printed document on my desk that made my blood run cold. It was a business proposal, professionally formatted and meticulously researched, for a new client acquisition strategy that could potentially bring millions of dollars in revenue to Peterson Marketing. At the bottom of the document was a digital signature: M. Thompson, Senior Marketing Specialist. Marcus was still working, still producing professional quality projects, still trying to prove his value to the company that he could never actually leave. But the document also contained information that Marcus could only have obtained by accessing confidential files, monitoring competitor websites, and analyzing client communications that had occurred after his death. He wasn't just haunting our office. He was actively participating in our business operations while being completely invisible to most of the people around him. Comment below what you think I should have done at this point, because I was faced with an impossible decision about whether to expose Marcus's supernatural presence. That evening, I decided to confront Marcus directly about what I had discovered. I waited until everyone else had left the office, then approached his desk where he was working on what appeared to be a presentation for a client meeting scheduled for the following week. "Marcus," I said firmly, "we need to talk about what you're doing here." He looked up from his computer, and for the first time since his death, his eyes seemed completely focused and aware when they met mine. "Dave," he said, and his voice sounded different. Not just like a coworker making casual conversation, but like my friend recognizing someone important. "You can see me. I wondered if you could see me." "Yes, I can see you," I confirmed, my heart racing. "But Marcus, you're dead. You died 3 weeks ago in a car accident. This isn't real." "I know," he said simply, and the admission hit me like a physical blow. "I remember the accident. I remember losing control of the car, hitting the truck, the moment when everything went dark. But Dave, I can't leave. Not yet." "Why not? What's keeping you here?" Marcus gestured toward his computer screen, which from my perspective appeared to be turned off, but from his viewpoint was apparently displaying some kind of presentation. "My business plan," he said. "I was so close to finishing it. 5 years of research, 5 years of planning, and I was maybe 2 months away from being ready to start my own agency. I can't just let it go. I can't let all that work be wasted. Marcus, it doesn't matter anymore. You're dead. The business plan died with you." "But it doesn't have to," he insisted, his voice becoming more animated. "Look, I've been working on it since the accident. I'm getting so much done, Dave. I don't get tired anymore. I don't get distracted. I don't waste time on lunch breaks or small talk. I can work 16 hours a day on this project. I'm closer to completing it than I ever was when I was alive." The obsession in his voice was chilling. Death hadn't freed Marcus from his workaholic tendencies. It had amplified them, removed all the biological limitations that had previously forced him to rest, eat, sleep, and engage with other aspects of life. He had become a supernatural entity whose entire existence was focused on completing a business plan that could never actually be implemented. "And then what?" I asked. "Let's say you finish your business plan. What happens then? Are you going to try to start a company as a ghost? Are you going to haunt potential clients until they sign contracts?" Marcus looked confused, as if this obvious problem had never occurred to him. I don't know. I just know I need to finish this. It's the most important thing I've ever worked on. Let me know in the comments if you think there was anything I could have said to convince Marcus to move on, because what happened during our conversation revealed the true horror of his situation. The longer I talked with Marcus, the more I realized that his death hadn't just trapped him in our office. It had fundamentally broken something in his understanding of reality. He could acknowledge that he was dead. He could remember the accident, but he couldn't grasp the logical implications of his situation. His obsession with completing his business plan had become a kind of supernatural tunnel vision that prevented him from seeing how impossible and pointless his continued work had become. "Marcus," I said, trying a different approach, "what about Sarah? What about your family? Don't you want to be with them instead of stuck in this office forever?" His expression became pained, and for a moment, he looked more human and vulnerable than he had since returning from the dead. "I think about Sarah every day," he admitted. "I can feel her grieving, and it breaks my heart. But Dave, she'll understand once I finish this project. She always knew how important it was to me. She used to tease me about working so much, but she also knew that starting my own agency was my biggest dream. But you can't start an agency now, Marcus. You're dead. Sarah needs to grieve and move on with her life, not wait for you to complete some impossible project." "It's not impossible," he said stubbornly. "Look, I've been thinking about this. Once I finish the business plan, once I have everything documented and organized, I can find a way to communicate with Sarah. I can show her what I've accomplished, give her the plan. Maybe she can start the agency in my memory. It could be our legacy together." The delusion in his reasoning was heartbreaking. Marcus had convinced himself that his supernatural imprisonment was actually a gift, an opportunity to complete his life's work under ideal conditions. He couldn't see that his obsession was preventing both him from finding peace and the people who loved him from healing properly. But as we continued talking, I began to notice something that filled me with a new kind of dread. Marcus was becoming more solid, more present, with each word we exchanged. What had started as a conversation with a translucent figure was beginning to feel like talking to a living person. I could see him more clearly, hear his voice more distinctly, and even feel a subtle change in the air temperature around him. Our conversation was somehow feeding his connection to the physical world, making him stronger and more anchored to our reality. And if Marcus continued to gain solidity and power, what would that mean for the rest of us who worked in this office? Hit the like button if you're realizing how dangerous this situation was becoming, because what happened over the next few days showed me that some spirits become more threatening when they grow stronger. My fears were confirmed when I arrived at work the next morning to find chaos in the office. The computer system had crashed overnight, but not in any way that our IT department could explain or fix. Every terminal was displaying the same screen, a complex business presentation that detailed Marcus's agency plans, complete with financial projections, client acquisition strategies, and marketing materials. The presentation couldn't be closed, minimized, or deleted. Rebooting the computers just brought the same files back up immediately. The network servers were operating normally, but every workstation in the office was locked into displaying Marcus's supernatural business plan. "This is impossible," muttered Rick from IT, staring at the screens in confusion. "These files aren't stored on any of our servers. They're not in our system at all, but somehow they're overriding everything else." Janet called an emergency staff meeting to address the technical crisis, but as she spoke, her computer screen began displaying new content in real time. We watched in stunned silence as spreadsheets updated themselves, graphs modified their own data, and presentation slides rewrote their text while Janet was trying to conduct the meeting. "Someone is actively accessing our system," Rick announced, his voice shaking. "But I can't find any evidence of external intrusion, no unauthorized logins, nothing that explains how this is happening." I knew exactly what was happening, but I couldn't explain it without revealing Marcus's supernatural presence. He was using the computer system to present his completed work to everyone in the office simultaneously, trying to get recognition and validation for the project that had consumed his life and trapped his death. But the technological disruption was just the beginning. As the day progressed, Marcus's influence on the physical environment became more pronounced and more disturbing. Phones rang constantly with no callers on the line. The temperature in the office dropped to uncomfortably cold levels that the building's heating system couldn't correct. Office supplies moved by themselves, files reorganized themselves overnight, and several people reported hearing typing sounds and muffled conversations coming from empty areas of the building. Most disturbing of all, people were beginning to see Marcus more clearly. Jessica screamed when she turned around and saw him standing directly behind her chair. Tom nearly fainted when Marcus appeared beside him in the break room, trying to engage in a casual conversation about weekend plans. Janet locked herself in her office after Marcus walked uninvited into a client meeting and began presenting his business plan to visitors who couldn't see or hear him. Comment below what you think was going to happen next, because the office was quickly becoming uninhabitable as Marcus grew stronger. By the end of the week, the situation had deteriorated to the point where most employees were afraid to come to work. The building felt actively hostile, filled with cold spots, strange sounds, and the constant sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. Equipment malfunctioned constantly, communication systems were unreliable, and the overall atmosphere was so oppressive that several people had already submitted their resignations. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the chaos he was causing. From his perspective, he was finally getting the attention and recognition his work deserved. He had completed his business plan, integrated it into the company's computer system, and was actively trying to present it to anyone who would listen. The fact that his supernatural presence was terrifying his former coworkers didn't seem to register with him at all. I realized that I had to take more drastic action to stop Marcus before his haunting destroyed the office entirely, or worse, before someone got seriously hurt. His growing connection to physical reality meant that he might eventually become capable of more than just moving objects and disrupting electronics. If his obsession continued to fuel his supernatural strength, he could become genuinely dangerous to the living people around him. That Friday evening, I stayed late once again to confront Marcus about the escalating situation. I found him at his desk, working on what appeared to be a presentation for potential investors, completely absorbed in his impossible project. "Marcus," I said, "you have to stop this. You're scaring everyone. People are quitting their jobs because of what you're doing." He looked up at me with surprise, as if the idea that his behavior was causing problems had never occurred to him. "But Dave, I'm almost done. Look, I've got everything organized now, the business plan, the financial projections, the marketing strategy, everything we need to start the agency. I just need more time to present it properly. Once everyone sees how comprehensive this plan is, how much potential it has, they'll understand why I couldn't just leave." "Marcus, listen to yourself," I said, my voice rising with frustration and fear. "You're talking about presenting a business plan to people who can't even see you. You're disrupting everyone's work, crashing our computer systems, and terrifying the entire office. This isn't about completing your project anymore. This has become something else entirely." For the first time since our conversation began, Marcus's confident expression faltered slightly. He looked around the office as if seeing it clearly for the first time, noticing the chaos that his supernatural presence had created. Papers were scattered across several desks from his interactions with filing systems. The temperature was so cold that frost was beginning to form on the windows despite the heating system running at maximum capacity. Electronic devices were flickering and malfunctioning throughout the building. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, his voice carrying a hint of confusion. "I was just trying to work. I was just trying to finish what I started." "But you can't finish it, Marcus. Not like this. You're not alive anymore. You can't run a business, you can't sign contracts, you can't meet with clients. What you're doing here isn't work. It's an obsession that's consuming you and hurting everyone around you." Marcus's form flickered for a moment, becoming translucent again before solidifying. "But if I stop working, if I give up on the plan, then everything I sacrificed for it was meaningless. All those late nights, all those weekends, all the time I didn't spend with Sarah because I was building something for our future, it would all be for nothing." The pain in his voice was heartbreaking, but it was also terrifying because I could see that his obsession was beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond the normal emotions that might have convinced a living person to change course. Death had stripped away everything human about Marcus except his drive to complete his work, and that single-minded focus was making him increasingly dangerous. "Marcus," I said carefully, "what happened to Sarah after you died? Have you seen her? Have you tried to contact her?" His expression became distant and troubled. She's grieving. I can sense her sometimes, especially late at night when I'm working. She's in so much pain, Dave. She cries herself to sleep almost every night. But once I finish the business plan, once I can show her what I've accomplished, she'll understand that my death wasn't the end. She'll see that I found a way to complete our dreams together. That's not what she needs, Marcus. She needs to heal. She needs to move on with her life. By staying here, by continuing to work on this impossible project, you're keeping her trapped in grief just like you're trapped in this office." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. His attention had returned to his computer screen, and his fingers were moving across the keyboard with increasing speed and intensity. "I'm so close," he muttered, his voice becoming more distant. "Just a few more adjustments to the financial projections, a few more client profiles, and the plan will be perfect." I realized with growing horror that my conversation with Marcus hadn't convinced him to give up his obsession. It had actually made him more determined to complete his work. Our interaction had somehow fed his supernatural energy, making him more solid and more connected to the physical world, but it had also intensified his fixation on the business plan that could never be implemented. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, because what happened next showed me that some spirits become more dangerous the stronger they get. As Marcus worked with renewed intensity, the supernatural disruptions in the office escalated to levels that were no longer just inconvenient. They were becoming genuinely threatening. The computer screens throughout the building began displaying rapidly changing images, financial charts, marketing strategies, client profiles, all updating and modifying themselves at superhuman speed. The data was accurate, professional, and impossibly comprehensive, as if Marcus had gained access not just to our company's information, but to confidential databases from competitors, potential clients, and market research firms. But the information came with a cost. Every computer that displayed Marcus's work began to overheat. Hard drives started failing. The electrical system in the building became unstable, with lights flickering and power surges affecting everything from the coffee makers to the security systems. Most disturbing of all, Marcus's presence was no longer confined to his desk, or even to our floor of the building. I began to see him in multiple places simultaneously, working at his desk, standing in the break room, walking through the lobby, sitting in conference rooms conducting meetings with people who weren't there. It was as if his obsession had become so intense that it was creating multiple versions of himself, each focused on a different aspect of his impossible business plan. The other employees were beyond frightened now. They were genuinely panicked. Jessica had stopped coming to work entirely after Marcus appeared in her car during her morning commute, trying to discuss marketing strategies while she drove. Tom was seeing a therapist and taking anxiety medication because he kept hearing Marcus's voice offering work advice during family dinners and social events. Janet had hired a consultant to investigate possible electromagnetic interference or environmental toxins that might be causing the office-wide hallucinations and technical problems. But I knew that no environmental consultant would be able to explain what was happening. Marcus's supernatural presence was growing stronger and more pervasive with each day, fueled by an obsession that death had only intensified rather than ended. By the following Monday, the situation had become completely unmanageable. I arrived at work to find the building's security guards standing outside, refusing to enter because the alarm system had been triggering constantly throughout the weekend with no apparent cause. The elevators weren't working properly, stopping at floors randomly and opening their doors to reveal empty cars that played recordings of Marcus's voice giving presentations to invisible audiences. When I finally made it to our floor, I discovered that Marcus had somehow accessed every computer in the building simultaneously. Every screen displayed the same message: Thompson Marketing Solutions. Business plan complete. Ready for implementation. The business plan was indeed complete. Hundreds of pages of detailed strategies, financial projections, marketing materials, and operational procedures that would have taken a living person months or years to develop. It was comprehensive, professional, and absolutely impossible to implement because it had been created by a dead man who could no longer interact with the living world in any meaningful way. But Marcus didn't seem to understand this limitation. As I watched in fascination and terror, I saw him moving through the office with purpose and determination, carrying files that existed only in his supernatural perception, making phone calls to potential clients who couldn't hear him, and preparing for meetings that would never happen. His obsession had reached a level where he was no longer just haunting our office. He was trying to run his business from beyond the grave, completely detached from the reality that his death made such efforts impossible. Let me know in the comments what you think I should have done at this point, because I was witnessing something that challenged every assumption about what happens when obsession survives death. Paragrapho 5, 2,000 words. That Tuesday morning, I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I couldn't continue to watch Marcus's supernatural obsession destroy our office and terrorize my coworkers, but I also couldn't find any way to reason with him or convince him to move on. His fixation on completing his business plan had become so intense that it seemed to be the only thing keeping his spirit anchored to our world, so I decided to help him finish it. I stayed after work and accessed Marcus's computer files, adding the final elements that his business plan was missing. I completed his client research, finalized his financial projections, and wrote the executive summary that would have made his proposal ready for presentation to investors. It took me 3 nights of intensive work, but by Friday evening, Marcus's business plan was truly complete, a comprehensive, professional document that could have actually been used to start a successful marketing agency. I thought that finishing the project would give Marcus the closure he needed to move on, that completing his life's work would finally allow his spirit to find peace. I imagined him reviewing the finished plan, feeling satisfied with what he had accomplished, and then fading away to whatever comes after death. I was catastrophically wrong. When Marcus discovered that his business plan was complete, his supernatural presence didn't diminish. It exploded. The finished project didn't give him peace. It gave him validation that his obsession had been justified all along. If the plan was complete and professional enough to actually implement, then his death had been meaningless. His sacrifice had been for nothing, and his continued existence was now focused on a new, impossible goal: actually starting the business. The haunting that had previously been confined to our office building began to spread throughout the city. Marcus's spirit started appearing at potential client locations, trying to schedule meetings and present his business plan to executives who couldn't see or hear him. He haunted the offices of marketing firms that he considered competitors, attempting to steal clients and disrupt their operations. He manifested at business networking events, conferences, and industry gatherings, growing stronger and more solid with each unsuccessful attempt to conduct business as a ghost. But the most devastating effect was on the people who had been close to him when he was alive. Sarah, his girlfriend, started experiencing supernatural encounters that went far beyond the gentle presence she had initially felt after his death. Marcus began appearing in her apartment, her workplace, and even in her dreams, trying to show her his completed business plan and convince her to start the agency on his behalf. At first, Sarah thought she was experiencing some kind of healing visitation from beyond the grave. She called me in tears, describing how Marcus had appeared to her and shown her a comprehensive business plan that represented everything he had hoped to accomplish in life. She interpreted this as a sign that he was at peace and wanted her to fulfill his dreams. But when Sarah actually tried to implement Marcus's plan, contacting the clients he had researched, meeting with the investors he had identified, attempting to start the marketing agency he had envisioned, she discovered that Marcus's supernatural involvement made the project impossible to complete. Every business meeting she scheduled was disrupted by unexplained technical failures. Potential clients reported feeling uncomfortable and watched during presentations. Investors complained about cold drafts, electrical problems, and the unsettling sensation that someone was standing behind them throughout their meetings with Sarah. Marcus's spirit had become so attached to his business plan that he couldn't allow anyone else to implement it without his direct involvement. But his supernatural presence made it impossible for living people to conduct the business relationships necessary to actually start a company. Sarah quickly became exhausted, frustrated and frightened by the supernatural chaos that surrounded every attempt to honor Marcus's business dreams. She started avoiding her apartment because Marcus would appear there every night, working on revisions to the business plan and trying to discuss strategy for a company that could never exist. Hit the like button if you're understanding how my attempt to help Marcus only made everything worse. Within 2 months of completing Marcus's business plan, 3 more people from our office had quit their jobs due to supernatural encounters. Marcus was no longer just haunting Peterson Marketing. He was following former employees to their new workplaces, trying to recruit them for his impossible ghost agency. He appeared to Jessica at her new job, offering her a position as his creative director. He haunted Tom during job interviews, trying to give him advice and accidentally sabotaging his attempts to find new employment. Janet, our former boss, was hospitalized for exhaustion and anxiety after Marcus appeared during a client presentation and began giving his own pitch for his supernatural business plan. The clients couldn't see or hear Marcus, but they could sense his presence, and the meeting ended with everyone feeling so uncomfortable that they terminated their contract with Peterson Marketing entirely. The company I had worked at for 5 years was slowly collapsing under the weight of Marcus's expanding haunting. Clients were leaving, employees were quitting, and the building itself was becoming uninhabitable due to constant technical problems, temperature fluctuations, and the overwhelming sense of being watched by invisible eyes. But Marcus remained completely oblivious to the chaos he was causing. From his perspective, he was simply working harder than ever to make his business dreams a reality. He had moved beyond the limitations of physical existence, gaining access to information and capabilities that no living entrepreneur could match. And he couldn't understand why his supernatural advantages weren't translating into business success. I realized that I had made a terrible mistake by helping him complete his business plan. Instead of giving Marcus closure, I had provided him with validation for an obsession that was now completely divorced from reality. His spirit was no longer just trapped in our office, it was actively spreading throughout the business community, creating supernatural disruptions wherever he tried to conduct his impossible entrepreneurial activities. Comment below what you think could have stopped Marcus at this point, because the situation continued to escalate beyond anything I could have imagined. The final straw came 6 months after Marcus's death, when Sarah called me at 3 a.m, sobbing hysterically and begging me to meet her at the cemetery where Marcus was buried. She had been trying to implement his business plan for months, but every attempt had been sabotaged by his supernatural presence. Finally, in desperation, she had decided to confront him directly at his grave, hoping that the location of his physical remains might give her some power to reason with his spirit. When I arrived at the cemetery, I found Sarah kneeling beside Marcus's headstone, surrounded by business documents that were scattered across the ground by wind that seemed to come from nowhere. She was holding a printed copy of his business plan, and as I watched in horror, I could see that the pages were rewriting themselves in real time, with new text appearing and disappearing, as if Marcus was still editing the document, even as Sarah tried to read it. "He won't let me go, Dave," Sarah said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. "I've tried to honor his memory. I've tried to make his business dreams come true. But nothing I do is good enough. He keeps changing the plan, adding new requirements, demanding more research, more meetings, more work. It never ends. As she spoke, Marcus's spirit materialized beside his grave, more solid and real-looking than I had ever seen him. But this wasn't the professional, determined version of Marcus that I'd been observing in the office. This was something else, a supernatural entity that still wore Marcus's face, but had been twisted by months of obsession and detachment from human reality. "Sarah," Marcus's spirit said, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo, "I've been waiting for you. Look, I've updated the financial projections again. The market analysis shows even more potential than we originally calculated. We can expand into digital marketing, social media management, maybe even international clients." Sarah looked directly at Marcus's spirit, and I realized that his supernatural strength had grown to the point where she could see and hear him clearly. But the expression on her face wasn't love or joy, it was terror and desperation. "Marcus," she said, her voice breaking, "you're dead. This has to stop. I can't build a business with a ghost. I can't live my life trying to implement plans that can never work in the real world." "But they can work," Marcus insisted, his form flickering between solid and translucent. "I have access to information that living competitors can't reach. I can research clients 24 hours a day. I can analyze market trends without ever getting tired. We can build something incredible together, Sarah, something that transcends the limitations of mortality." "I don't want to transcend mortality," Sarah screamed, throwing the business plan documents into the wind. "I want to grieve my fiancé and move on with my life. I want to remember you as the man I loved, not as this obsessed thing that won't leave me alone." Marcus's spirit reacted to Sarah's rejection with a fury that shook the ground beneath our feet. The temperature dropped so quickly that our breath became visible, and every streetlight around the cemetery began flickering rapidly. For a moment, I thought he might actually become violent, that his supernatural obsession had grown strong enough to allow him to physically harm the living people around him. But instead, Marcus's spirit simply looked confused and hurt, as if he genuinely couldn't understand why Sarah wasn't grateful for his continued dedication to their shared future. "I'm doing this for us," he said, his voice becoming more distant and hollow. "Everything I'm doing is for us." And then he vanished, but I knew he hadn't moved on. He had simply returned to wherever his supernatural obsession was taking him next, continuing his impossible work, growing stronger and more detached from human reality with each passing day. That was 8 months ago. Marcus's spirit continues to haunt the Denver business community, appearing at networking events, disrupting competitor meetings, and trying to recruit employees for his phantom marketing agency. Sarah moved to another state to escape his supernatural attention, but she still receives emails from accounts that don't exist, containing updated versions of his business plan and requests for meetings that can never happen. Peterson Marketing eventually closed down entirely, unable to operate in a building that had become permanently haunted by an entity that refused to accept the reality of death. The other employees have all moved on to new jobs, but several of them still report supernatural encounters with Marcus, who continues to view them as potential team members for his impossible business venture. I found a new job at a different marketing firm, but I live in constant fear that Marcus will discover my new workplace and begin haunting it too. Sometimes I wonder if I should have let his business plan remain unfinished, if allowing him to feel incomplete might have eventually convinced him to move on. But I suspect that Marcus's obsession was too strong to be stopped by logic, completion, or even death itself. Some people become so identified with their work, so consumed by their professional ambitions, that they literally cannot exist without them. Death didn't free Marcus from his workaholic tendencies. It transformed him into a supernatural entity whose entire existence is defined by an impossible pursuit of business success. The most terrifying part of this story isn't that Marcus's spirit continues to haunt our city, although that's frightening enough. The most terrifying part is that he seems genuinely happy in his supernatural state. From his perspective, death freed him from the biological limitations that were holding back his entrepreneurial potential. He doesn't see his condition as a curse or a tragedy. He sees it as the ultimate work-life balance solution. Let me know in the comments if you've ever known someone so obsessed with their career that you could imagine them continuing to work even after death, because Marcus's story proves that some obsessions are literally stronger than the grave. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, and remember, the next time you meet someone who says they're married to their job, consider the possibility that they might mean it more literally than you realize. I still drive past the old Peterson Marketing building sometimes, and I swear I can see lights on in the windows late at night. the glow of computer screens displaying presentations that no living person will ever see. Marcus is still in there, still working on his business plan, still trying to build something that can never exist in the world of the living. And somewhere in the supernatural realm where obsession transcends mortality, I have the horrible suspicion that he's finally genuinely happy.